for those of us who might not precisely recall, what happened 10 years ago, starting on August 10th, 2014, in Ferguson, Missouri?
So the town of Ferguson had really not been as well known outside of Missouri before August 9th, 2014. That was the day that a teenage boy, a young African-American teenage boy named Mike Brown, he was 18 years old, was shot and killed by a police officer named Darren Wilson in the middle of the street in Ferguson in broad daylight. And it wouldn't have even that horrific thing wouldn't have been as remarkable were it not for the fact that the police allowed his body, his corpse, to remain in the sun for hours. And I mean, which is just even more dehumanizing. And people gathered, they took photographs, they posted to social media, and there started being gatherings in the place where his body had fallen. Eventually, of course, it was carried away. And people had had enough. It wasn't, of course, just that one shooting, one fatal shooting of a young Black man, but it was the one that broke the straw that proverbially broke the camel's back. And people began, the hashtag Black Lives Matter began trending in earnest. It hadn't been coined at that time. It had been coined about a year earlier when George Zimmerman, the person who killed Trayvon Martin, the vigilante, police adjacent person who killed Trayvon Martin, had been acquitted of that murder in Florida. That's when the three founders of the slogan Black Lives Matter came up with it. But it wasn't until Ferguson and Mike Brown's killing a year later that it began trending on then Twitter. And Black Twitter was very active at that time. And the story I tell in my book, Rising Up, is that people changed how we viewed police killings, because for the first time, we didn't have to wait for the witnesses to that violence, didn't have to wait for the mainstream media to tell the filtered story through police eyes. They posted the pictures themselves, they generated outrage, and before they knew it, people were descending on Ferguson to support the local uprising that had begun. And today, many, many, many Black Lives Matter activists who cut their teeth in Ferguson remain active. They traveled there, they got trained there, they learned about how to engage in solidarity and tactics around how to confront police. And it became this incredible flashpoint in American history. It was also one of the high points of Black Twitter that had such power, such narrative power to change the debate on policing. And I really feel it set the stage for the mass uprising nationwide that came 6 years later in 2020, in May of 2020, when George Floyd was killed on May 26th in Minneapolis.
And when we look at the life cycle of revolt, of revolution, of uprising, Sonali, it seems to me it's interesting how these things grow and develop and reach a flashpoint. We had, as you mentioned, the murder of Trayvon Martin a year earlier, the shooting, regardless of what the law ultimately decreed, and just a few weeks before the death of Michael Brown, on June 17th, 2014, we had the famous and horrifying incident captured on video of Eric Garner being suffocated by a police stranglehold and saying, "I can't breathe," a phrase that's been repeated many times by Black victims of police violence. So you had, it seems to me, a public that had become aware of this. And it also seems to me that what we learned, we covered on this program, we covered the Ferguson uprising pretty extensively. I wasn't able to go, but we sent people and live streamed it, did all sorts of things. Well, and for my part, it was mostly research, but one of the things that came out of it is that in tandem, and I know you've written about this as well in great detail, in tandem with the brutality of the police violence, we had the structural violence in a place like Ferguson of policing being used to extract wealth from bicycle riders who were disproportionately ticketed if they were Black and fined, and that being used for various operational cost, speeding tickets, and you've written even recently about the exploitation of people who are sent into the penal system in terms of paying for video calls or whatever it might be. So it soon developed that it seemed that this was the violent edge of a sort of internally colonized population, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that aspect up because sometimes that has gotten lost in the coverage around Ferguson, that there had been this, as you put it, structural violence, institutionalized criminalization of the Black population. And the police, local police department made a lot of money from finding them. And of course, a lot of folks who live on the edge of the economy, who don't have savings and are fined once, end up being driven into cycles of debt. And so all of that was actually outlined in the federal government's report on Ferguson later on. You know, this also happened at the time when the nation had its first Black president and its first attorney general, Barack Obama and Eric Holder. And there was a federal consent decree, and there was national and sort of federal attention paid to policing. But of course, in the end, Ferguson, it was local activists in Ferguson that changed things. I spoke to State Senator Brian Williams on my show last week. He is someone who was raised in Ferguson, and it was through people like him using the political process to push through police reforms. In the end, they were also just still reforms. But another thing that Ferguson really raised, going back to your point about structural violence, is it raised that, or it helped the beginnings of the conversation around how we tackle racial capitalism, that policing is seen as the enforcement of a violent system of inequality, and that instead of pouring money into policing, even when we pour money into all of the other things that actually keep us safe besides policing, we'll have a much better society, a society that doesn't violently enforce inequality and actually fuels equality. So the conversation around defund the police also began in Ferguson, and then actually became very, very popular in Oakland, California, which was an epicenter where activists actually did begin moving money away from policing. So much began in Ferguson, and that aspect of it, the racial capitalism aspect of it, that police are an intricate part of, was also raised.
And right around this same time, we had this. It was peaking. It continues, but it was cresting this fetishization of militarized policing in this country. I remember I looked it up. August 18th, so just over a week later, I wrote a piece about the fact that 60 Minutes had run an item called counterinsurgency cops, which is such a horrifying phrase when you think about it. But the fact that the US military was flooding police forces around the country, especially, but not exclusively, urban police forces with tanks and anti-personnel weaponry of various kinds, SWAT teams in little country towns, the shift of any vestige of thinking that police were a community self, monitoring force to an occupying army, and the media kind of, in my view, going along with that, even though I looked at the statistics at the time, violent crimes were way down from 1993 to 2012, which were the newest statistics at the time. Homicide rates way down from 1993 to 2011, but we still had this seemingly irreversible militarization of our police force. And it seems to me that Ferguson at least began the conversation. I don't know if we've stemmed that tide or even slowed it much, but at least it began a conversation, don't you think?
Yeah, that moment in time was horrifying for so many Americans because the photos coming out of Ferguson looked like they were from Iraq. Tanks on the streets, the militarized response was so severe. It started the conversation that helped people know for the first time that militaries, the US military surplus weapons often are distributed to police forces around the country and then turned onto us. And so, yes, that is such an important aspect of it. It's become routine to see police showing up in flak jackets, armed to the hilt against nonviolent protesters. We saw that in 2020 during the racial justice uprisings in the summer of 2020 in various cities around the country. And there was one tiny statistic that I saw recently, Richard, that really made me think, all right, maybe we might have started to, I hope, turn the corner on policing, which is that although fatal police killings keep going up, the number of Black people killed by police for the first time in US history has slowly started to go down. Whether that's because of increased scrutiny on police killings of Black people, I don't really know for sure. But it is, I do give credit to the activism around Black Lives Matter since 2014 that has really helped us pay closer attention to that, draw attention to that, and say we cannot keep accepting this. This is not something that should be taken for granted. And to your point around crime rates falling, they're continuing to fall. So this year, as we sit between now and November elections, you're going to hear a lot of politicians, especially running for office, especially on the Republican side of the ticket, who are going to try to scare you into thinking crime rates are rising, the Democrats are doing nothing about it. Sadly, both Democrats and Republicans end up throwing money at police, but you hear a lot of, and you will hear more tough on crime rhetoric, which is simply not borne out in facts. In the FBI's own statistics show that violent crime is way down. Burglaries are down. Murder and rapes are down. And so we're having this disconnect because in the end, politicians want to uphold our racial capitalist system. Fuel inequality on the bottom, fund police to keep people down who are struggling financially.
And there's one last piece of this that I don't want to miss, Sonali, which is, to me, one of the profound things about the Ferguson uprising was the sort of seemingly spontaneous emanation of a sense of global solidarity. We saw a hint of this even in 2011 in the Wisconsin occupation of the Capitol, where demonstrators in Tahrir Square in Egypt sent pizza delivery orders to the demonstrators at the Capitol there. But we had in the Ferguson uprising, I remember Palestinian activists sending messages of support. I remember seeing a graffiti sprayed across the wall in Ferguson that said Fergustine, a sort of conscious linking of these two occupied peoples, if you will. And it strikes me that, we saw with Black Lives Matter, the 2020 movement, that kind of international resonance as well. I'm wondering if we're not seeing that today in a kind of two-way flow, given both the outpouring of activist support for Gaza right now in the United States and perhaps sympathy for the U.S. struggle around the world. And I'm just wondering,
Absolutely.
Yeah, if you agree and if what you see going forward in the next.
Well, Black Americans have been some of the most powerful cultural ambassadors that the United States has ever produced. And everything from jazz and hip hop and breakdancing to the incredible, powerful political responses, such as the civil rights movement and the Black Power movements, and authors and cultural warriors like James Baldwin, to today the Black Lives Matter movement, that have inspired movements and cultural shifts worldwide. So you've absolutely seen the mantle of activism against police violence being raised worldwide. You see communities of color seeing that very important racial analysis that has originated in the US and applying it to their own circumstances, where they see Israeli soldiers as akin to American police and Palestinian victims as akin to Black Americans. Or in Britain right now, where you're having these horrible racist vigilante attacks against immigrants, you're seeing that same lens being applied. In France, home of the recent home of the Olympics, you saw people talking about police violence against the unhoused and making links with the Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States. You see it in New Zealand with Indigenous-led movements and First Nations communities in Canada. So that internationalization, the globalization of solidarity, where people see state violence as a common enemy, is incredibly powerful. And it's precisely what, the powers that be, if you will, don't want us to see those commonalities. And I love that. It's a very important point that I think we should uphold.
I love that phrase, the globalization of solidarity, since we've seen the globalization of finance, of colonialism, of racism. That's a phrase to end on. We depend on your support here at the 0 Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.